Today's gospel, we're reminded of Jesus and his saying, "Pride goes beyond all fall." In the past few weeks, our scriptures discussed our faith, gratitude, and perseverance in prayer. Today we reflect on humility and simplicity, the Lord condemning an attitude of smugness and self-satisfaction that we heard today in the gospel. Pharisees and tax collectors' story is probably familiar to all of us. The Pharisees' prayer was the longest of the two, very self-congratulatory. I do this, I do that. I do that for you, God, speaking of himself smugly, while the tax collector's prayer was a brief plea for mercy and forgiveness. Pharisees had a very high morals. They were honest, respectful people, reverent, fasting twice a week and tithing. Example of Pharisees that we know are St. Paul or Nathaniel or James or Nicodemus or Joseph of Arimathea. They were all Pharisees. You may prefer them to be your neighbor rather than the tax collector or a Sadducee that didn't believe in the resurrection. Maybe we know some people who live like a Pharisee. They place their pious acts above everything else that they do. They fill their homes with shrines for God and say prayers constantly, but are anything but charitable sometimes to other people that they meet. Jesus is saying that prayer is good, but it needs to be the right kind of prayer that we say. Is our prayer boastful like the Pharisees or humble like that of the tax collector? We hear the Pharisees focusing on himself in prayer, while the tax collector focusing on God. Something we may want to think about this week is, how have I prayed this week? Am I tempted to be proud of my religious or moral accomplishments? When has my prayer been the most honest before God? And what does being humble really mean to me? We hear that the tax collector stood off at a distance when he prayed and would not even raise his eyes to God. A posture of humility, unworthy to be in God's presence. He acknowledges his sinfulness, and in his self-emptying, he is justified, allowing God to show mercy upon him. In Jesus' day, the parable had a twist. It would have been the impact on the hearer, since the Pharisees were looked up to, and everyone who didn't follow what they thought they should be living in their lives was looked on upon with contempt. The Pharisee sect may be death, but the spirit that they represent still lives. How do we look down on others who may look on things differently than ourselves, or the way that we may live our lives? Looking at our first reading in Sirach, it reminds us that the prayer of the humble will be penetrated to heaven. And even in our psalm response, it said, "The Lord hears the cry of the poor," because of their sincerity of heart and the trusting in God to hear their prayers and fulfill them. Paul, in the second letter to Timothy, says how he trusts in God to bring him safely to heaven. And after all the struggles that Paul had gone through, he looks to God to take care of him in all the different struggles that he went through in his life, just like we ask God to take care of us in our struggles in our life. Perhaps the Pharisee in our story did think of himself as having higher moral standards than the tax collector. He was not a cause for boasting, but a chance to serve others. I wonder what would have happened if the Pharisee would have offered friendship with the tax collector. It may have made both of them better people. So let us pray for the gift of humility in our prayer, thanking God and being grateful for all that he has given us, knowing that the Lord hears our simple hearts as we say in our prayers, "Lord, be merciful to me, a sinner," as the tax collector said.